moved to Ione, California in the spring of 2023. It's a small town in Amador County, maybe 800 people if you count the ones who technically live outside the town limits, but still get their mail at the post office on Main Street. I'd taken a job doing intake at the county health clinic, the kind of job where you sit behind plexiglass and ask people for their insurance cards, and I found a rental on Church Street, a narrow road that runs behind the old preservation district, lined with houses built sometime in the 1880s when the town still had a working mine nearby. The house was small, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since maybe 1994, and a backyard that backed up against a drainage ditch, and then a stretch of dry grass that belonged to nobody in particular. My landlord, a guy named Terrence Boyd, who lived 2 towns over in Jackson, told me the house had been empty for almost a year before I moved in. He didn't say why. I didn't ask. Rent was $600 less than anything comparable in Sacramento, and at 26, fresh out of a relationship that had eaten most of my savings, that was all the information I needed. For the first few months, nothing happened. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these stories usually go. Creaking floorboards on night 1, a shadow in the hallway by week 2. It wasn't like that. It was ordinary. I unpacked slowly, hung some string lights over my bed, got to know the woman 2 doors down, an older lady named Carol Whitfield, who kept chickens and would leave eggs on my porch in a repurposed egg carton with a rubber band around it. I started dating someone from the clinic, a phlebotomist named Marcus Yee, though it didn't last past July. Normal life. Small. The first thing I actually noticed, and at the time I didn't think anything of it, was in early August. I worked a Tuesday closing shift, got home around 9:40 p.m., and as I was unlocking my front door, I glanced toward the vacant lot behind my backyard and saw a light. Not a flashlight exactly, more like the glow you'd get from a phone screen, low to the ground, like someone was sitting or crouched in the grass. It was maybe 60, 70 feet away. I stood there for a second, keys in the lock, and the light went out. I told myself it was probably a teenager. Ione doesn't have much for kids to do, and that lot was the kind of place high schoolers went to smoke or make out or whatever they still do. I went inside, locked the door, watched some television, and forgot about it within the hour. Except I didn't forget about it, not really, because 2 weeks later it happened again. Same time, almost exactly, I checked my phone and it was 9:52 p.m., same spot in the grass. This time I watched a little longer before it went dark. And this time, when it went dark, I heard something. Not footsteps exactly. More like the specific sound of dry grass compressing and then releasing, the sound something makes when it stands up out of a crouch. I went inside and I did lock the door that night, and I checked it twice, which wasn't something I usually did. I didn't tell anyone about it. I want to be honest about that, because I think that's part of what happened to me over the following weeks. This slow, private escalation where I kept deciding each individual thing wasn't quite worth mentioning to anyone. A light in a field. A ripple of grass. On their own, they sounded stupid out loud. I remember rehearsing, so there's maybe a guy who sits in the field behind my house sometimes. And it just didn't sound like something you call the sheriff's department about, not in a county where the nearest deputy might be 20 minutes out on a slow night. The next thing happened in September, and this one I did mention to Carol, over the fence one Saturday morning while she was feeding the chickens. I asked her, nodding toward the field. She got a look on her face I didn't like. Not scared exactly, careful. Kids sometimes, she said. You didn't know the Hendersons, did you? I told her no, I'd never met them. Nice people, she said, and then didn't say anything else about it, and went back to the chickens, and I got the distinct sense she decided not to finish the thought. I asked her straight out, did something happen to them? And she said, you'd have to ask Terrence about that, in a tone that made it clear she wasn't going to be the one to tell me. I did text Terrence. He didn't respond for 3 days, and when he did, all he said was, nothing happened here that would be relevant to your lease. Which is, in retrospect, an insane thing to say to a direct question, but I was new to renting from an actual human landlord instead of a company, and I didn't push it. Late September, the weather started turning, that dry, cold thing the foothills do before the rain comes back. I remember exactly what I was wearing on the night it really started, because it stuck with me. An old university sweatshirt, gray, with a hole starting at the left cuff, and flannel pajama pants I'd had since college. I remember because I was still wearing them 3 hours later when I called 911, and the dispatcher asked me to describe myself for the responding deputy, and I looked down at myself like I was seeing a stranger. It was a Thursday. I'd worked a normal day, come home around 6, made pasta, watched 2 episodes of a show I don't even remember the name of anymore. Around 11:15, I went to bed. I had a habit, I guess I still do it actually, of checking my phone one last time before I put it on the nightstand, and I remember the time on the screen was 11:19 p.m. when I set it down. I woke up at 2. Know the time because it's the first thing I looked at. That reflex you get when something wakes you up wrong, when your body knows before your brain does that something's not right. What woke me up was a sound at the back door, not a knock. More like someone testing the handle, a slow, careful turn, the kind of motion that's trying not to make noise and failing anyway because old doorknobs squeak no matter how gently you turn them. I lay there for a second, not moving. The house was completely dark except for the small green light on my router in the hallway. I could hear my own heartbeat, which sounds like something out of a bad script, but it's true. It was audible to me in a way it usually isn't. The knob turned again, then stopped. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving along the back porch, away from the door, and toward the kitchen window. My kitchen window doesn't have a curtain. I'd been meaning to buy one for months, and just hadn't. It looks directly onto a section of counter, and if you're standing at the right angle outside, into the hallway that leads to my bedroom. I got up. I didn't turn on any lights. I went to my dresser, and I want to be honest that I didn't have anything that could really be called a weapon. I grabbed a metal water bottle, which in hindsight would not have done much of anything, but it was the heaviest thing within reach. I stood in my hallway, in the dark, and I watched a shape cross in front of the kitchen window. Just a silhouette, backlit by nothing, because there's no streetlight back there. So really what I saw was an absence. A section of the window that should have shown me the shape of the drainage ditch and the field beyond it, and instead showed me black, moving black, for about 2 seconds before it was gone. I didn't call the police yet. I know that sounds strange. I think some part of me was still doing the thing I'd been doing for 2 months, the thing where I minimized it, where I told myself it was probably nothing right up until the moment I heard the back door handle turn a third time, and this time it didn't stop. It turned, and I heard the specific sound of someone applying real pressure to a lock, testing whether it would give. That's when I called. I was in my closet by then, phone in one hand, water bottle in the other, texting Carol at the same time with my thumb because some primal part of my brain decided a 71-year-old woman 2 houses down was my best chance of immediate backup. I told the dispatcher someone was trying to get into my house. She asked if I was safe. I said I did. She kept me on the line. Her name was Denise. I remember that. She told me her name. I don't know why that detail stuck. And she asked me to describe the sounds as they happened, which I did in this flat, weirdly calm voice that didn't feel like my own voice. The door handle stopped. There was a long silence. Denise later told me this was maybe 90 seconds, though it felt considerably longer. And then I heard footsteps again, moving away this time, back across the porch, back toward the field. I heard the grass, that same compressing, releasing sound from months earlier, except now it was retreating instead of approaching. And I understood, in a way that made my stomach drop, that whoever it was hadn't been panicked or rushed. They'd left at a walk. The deputy arrived 19 minutes later, which in a county that size is actually fast, and did a full walk of the property with a flashlight. He found the field trampled down in a rough oval about 70 feet from my back fence, consistent with someone having sat or crouched there repeatedly over time, based on how flattened the grass was. He found a single set of shoe prints in the soft dirt by my back door, a men's boot, medium to large size, no distinguishing tread pattern he could identify. Nothing else. No prints leading away through the field, because the ground out there was too hard-packed and dry to hold a print more than a few feet from my fence line. He asked if I had any idea who it could be. I told him about the light I'd seen twice before. He wrote it down, and I could tell from his face that the name meant something to him, but he didn't say what. When I pushed, I actually asked him directly, did something happen to the people who lived here before me? He gave me almost the same non-answer Terrence had. There's an open case involving a previous resident of this address. I can't discuss specifics. I remember that phrase specifically, an open case involving a previous resident, because it's the kind of sentence you turn over in your head at 3 a.m. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat on my couch with every light in the house on until it got bright outside, and then I drove straight to the clinic and worked a full shift on maybe 40 minutes of sleep, running on adrenaline that had nowhere to go. I want to skip ahead a little, because the next 6 weeks were mostly about me trying to feel safe again rather than any single terrifying event. I had a security company install cameras, 2 in the back, 1 covering the field, 1 on the porch itself, plus a doorbell camera up front. I bought curtains for the kitchen window that day. I asked Terrence, in writing this time, to change the locks, and he did, grudgingly, and billed me for half of it, which I paid without arguing because I just wanted it done. For about 3 weeks, nothing showed up. I checked the footage obsessively. I'm not exaggerating. I would wake up at random points in the night and just scroll through the motion alerts, most of which were raccoons or Carol's cat. I started to relax, a little. I told myself the deputy visit had scared whoever it was off for good, that cameras and new locks were enough, that this was a story that had already ended. Then, on a Sunday night in early November, the porch camera picked up 9 seconds of footage at 1:47 a.m. I've watched it probably 200 times since, and I still can't tell you exactly what it shows. It's a figure, standing at the edge of the porch light's range, facing the camera directly. Not the door, the camera. For the full 9 seconds, completely still. Whoever it is, get with the hood up, and because of the angle and the distance, the camera never resolves anything you could call a face. Just a general orientation of a head, tilted very slightly, like they're looking at the lens the way you'd look at someone's eyes. Then the feed cuts to black for exactly 1 frame. The security company later told me this was almost certainly a camera glitch, unrelated, a known issue with that model in cold weather. And when the picture comes back, the figure is gone. Not walking away, gone. No motion in the following clip, no one crossing back toward the field. I sent it to Terrence. I sent it to my sister in Stockton, who told me flatly that I needed to move. And honestly, by December, I agreed with her. I did find out one more thing before I left. And this is the part that still bothers me the most. More than the footprint, more than the 9 seconds of footage. I ran into Carol at the little grocery on Preston in mid-December, packing up boxes in my head the whole time. And I asked her again, point blank, what had happened to the Hendersons. This time she told me. Not much. She said the wife had moved out first, months before the husband, and that the husband had stayed in the house alone for a while after that. And that near the end, before Terrence finally got him to leave, neighbors had started noticing him standing in that same field behind the house at night, for no reason anyone could explain, sometimes for hours, just standing there facing the house. She said nobody ever called it in because it was his own house at the time, and there wasn't a law against a man standing in a field. She didn't know where he'd gone after he left. Nobody did. I looked a little after that. A last name, Henderson, in a county that size. Should be findable, and it partly was. Enough to confirm a Robert Henderson had in fact owned that address before Terrence bought it out of a short sale in 2022. But the trail on him personally just stops around then. No forwarding address anybody could point to. No new listing under his name in the county. Nothing. I moved out the first week of January 2024. I live in Lodi now, in an apartment complex with a gate code and neighbors close enough on either side that I can hear them through the walls, which used to bother me and now feels like the single most comforting thing about the place. The thing that still gets me, the detail I can't put down, is the way the figure was oriented in that clip, not toward the door, toward the camera, like it knew exactly where it was and wanted me to know it knew. I never did find out if it was Robert Henderson standing in that field again, coming back to a house that used to be his, for reasons that make some kind of terrible private sense to him and nobody else. I never found out who tried the back door that night in September, or whether it was the same person both times. I don't think I ever... Story 2. The man who delivered my packages. I want to start by saying I've thought about whether to tell this one at all, because most of it is going to sound like nothing happened. That's the part that scares me the most now, looking back. Nothing happened, technically. And I still moved out of the town I grew up in. I'm from Ligonier, Pennsylvania, a small borough out in Westmoreland County, maybe 1,500 people inside the actual town limits, with the kind of downtown square that gets its picture taken every Christmas because they still do the old-fashioned lighting ceremony. I lived there my whole life until 2025. My name doesn't matter much for this, but I'll say I was 29, working remote as a claims processor for an insurance company out of Pittsburgh, which meant I was home most days, alone, in a rental on a side street off of West Main. I want to talk about because he's the center of this, and because for the first year I knew him, I liked him. Dale Prescott drove one of the regional delivery routes. Not a national company exactly, one of the smaller regional contractors that a lot of the online retailers use to save money in rural areas. And because I worked from home and ordered a fair amount online, I probably saw him 2 or 3 times a week. He was maybe mid-40s, heavy-set, always wore the same navy fleece regardless of the weather, and he was, by every normal measure, a nice guy. Remembered my dog's name. Remembered I didn't like the packages left in direct sun because I'd once mentioned a candle had melted. Small stuff. The kind of familiarity you build up with somebody in a small town without ever really deciding to. It started, as far as I can tell now, in February of 2025. That's when the notes began. With a little smiley face. I actually thought it was sweet. I mentioned it to my coworker on a call, laughing about it, saying my delivery guy was the friendliest person I'd talked to all week. There was another note in March. then one in April that mentioned my dog by name unprompted, which in hindsight is odd because I don't think I'd ever told him her name. I think he must have heard me call for her once through the door while he was setting a package down. At the time, I didn't clock it as strange. Small towns, thin walls, dogs bark. You learn things about your neighbors' lives without meaning. By June, the notes had a different quality to them. I still have photos of a couple of them on my phone because at some point I started documenting things, though I couldn't tell you the exact day I decided that was necessary. Which meant he'd seen my house after dark, on a route that should have had him done for the day well before sunset in June. Another one, in July, said something like, "Hope the new boyfriend's treating you right. Saw the car in the driveway a few times." And that one I remember reading standing on my own porch in the middle of the afternoon and feeling something shift in my stomach, a specific cold kind of understanding that I had been too polite for 5 months to let myself have. I did the responsible thing, or what I thought was the responsible thing. I called the regional delivery contractor's customer service line, which took 40 minutes to get through, and told a very tired-sounding man named Perry that one of their drivers seemed to be paying unusual attention to my house and asked if the route could be reassigned. Perry told me he'd noted, and that was functionally the end of that conversation. I never heard back, and the same truck kept showing up. The boyfriend the note referenced was real, by the way. His name was Andres Ferreira, and we'd been together about 4 months by August. I told him about the notes, and he wanted to be there the next time a delivery came, which we arranged for a Tuesday when I had a package scheduled. Dale came at his normal time, around 2 p.m., saw Andres sitting on the porch with me, and this is the part that's hard to explain, hard to make sound as unsettling as it felt. He didn't act nervous or embarrassed or caught. He just smiled, set the box down, and said, "Guess I don't need to worry about you being lonely out here anymore," directly to me, like it was a compliment, like it was something a friend would say, while looking at Andres the entire time in a way that made the muscles in my shoulders go tight. Andres didn't say anything until Dale's truck had pulled away. Then he said, "That guy knows way too much about you." And I remember laughing it off, actually laughing, because that's what you do, I think, when the alternative is admitting you've let something dangerous escape. The notes stopped after that. For almost 2 months, nothing. No notes, and honestly, fewer sightings of Dale's truck at all, which I told myself meant the route had finally been reassigned, that Perry had actually done something. What happened instead, I found out much later, is that Dale had been put on a different route within the same contractor, one that covered a stretch of county road outside town rather than the borough itself. I only know this because of what happened in October, and because of a conversation I had afterward with a woman named Ione, who ran the little consignment shop 2 doors down from where I used to get coffee, and who it turned out had her own version of this story, except hers had started 3 years before mine and had never really stopped. October 9th, a Thursday, I remember, because I'd taken the day off work for a dentist appointment in Latrobe. I got home around 4:30, and Andres was working late that night, so it was just me and the dog. Around 9 p.m., I let her out into the backyard, which is fenced but backs onto a wooded strip that runs along the old rail trail behind the house. She started barking at the fence line in a way she didn't usually do, not the bark she does at deer, which is short and half-hearted, but a sustained, low, continuous bark that I'd honestly never heard from her before. I went out to get her, and standing at the tree line, maybe 40 feet back into the woods, close enough that the motion light over my patio caught the edge of him, was a man. I didn't recognize him at first. It was dark. He was standing still, half behind a tree, but something about the shape of him, the fleece, made my stomach drop before my brain had finished the thought. He didn't move. He didn't run. He just stood there, and I stood there for what was probably 5 seconds and felt like much longer, and then he turned and walked deeper into the trees, unhurried, the same unhurried way Dale always moved when he was working a route, like a man who had all the time in the world and no reason at all to rush. I got the dog inside and called the police that night. A deputy from the county sheriff's office came out. Ligonier itself has a small borough police presence, but this fell to the county, and took a report, walked the tree line with a flashlight, found nothing conclusive, no clear prints in the leaf litter back there. I told him about Dale, about the notes, about the delivery contractor. He said he'd look into it. I don't know if he ever did. 2 days later, I was with Priya at the consignment shop, mostly because I mentioned to her in passing that I'd started keeping the dog in at night, and something in my face must have prompted her to ask why. When I told her about Dale, she went very quiet, and then she told me she'd known him for years. He delivered to the shop for most of a decade, and that around 2021, before I'd have had much reason to notice, there had been a period where he'd started showing up at the shop after hours, technically off the clock, standing outside on the sidewalk for stretches at a time, until she'd complained to the contractor and he'd been moved off her route entirely. She said the notes had started for her too, small and friendly at first, and had gotten more specific over about 6 months before stopping the same way mine had. I asked her. Not that she knew of. Nothing ever escalated to a point where there was something you could point to and say, that's a crime, arrest him for that. Notes weren't a crime. Standing on a public sidewalk wasn't a crime. Standing in the woods on public land near a rail trail 40 feet from someone's fence technically wasn't a crime either, according to the deputy who'd come out to my house, though he did agree it was concerning behavior worth documenting. I confronted the contractor directly after that, in person, at their depot out on Route 30, and asked to speak to a manager, and was told, politely but firmly, that Dale Prescott was still an active contractor with them, that there had been informal complaints over the years, but nothing that rose to the level of termination, and that reassignment requests were handled on a route basis, not tied to individual customer preference. I left that conversation angrier than I'd been at any point up to then. Angrier than the woods, angrier than the notes, because it was the first time someone had said out loud, essentially, that this was allowed to keep happening. I saw him one more time. Late November, a Sunday afternoon, I was getting gas at the Sheets on the edge of town, and his truck, off-duty, his personal vehicle, not the delivery van, pulled into the pump across from mine. He got out, and for a second, I thought he hadn't noticed me. And then he looked directly at me, over the roof of his own car, and smiled, the same easy smile from the porch, and said, "Small world," and nothing else, and got back in his car after fueling and drove off in the opposite direction from his house, which I only knew because at some point during all of this, I'd looked up his address too, the same way he apparently knew mine. Andres and I moved to Greensburg in January 2026, about 30 minutes away, close enough that I still see people from Ligonier at the grocery store sometimes, far enough that I don't have a rail trail behind my house anymore. I never filed anything more formal than the 2 police reports. There was never anything more formal to file. I think about that a lot, actually, that the entire experience, start to finish, technically consisted of some friendly notes and a man standing in some trees, and that if I described it to a stranger in exactly those terms without the specific cumulative weight of how it felt to live inside it for 10 months, it would sound like nothing at all. The detail that stays with me isn't the woods, actually. It's that he knew Andres' name was significant enough to comment on before I'd ever introduced them. And to this day, I don't know how, because I never once mentioned Andres by name on a package, in a note, in anything Dale would have had access to through his job. I've turned it over so many times I've stopped being able to think of an innocent explanation, and I've also stopped being able to prove it wasn't one. Story 3. Night shift at Cedar Key. Cedar Key is a small island town off the Gulf Coast of Florida, out past Chiefland, connected to the mainland by a long causeway that floods sometimes during high tide in the fall. Fewer than 800 people live there year-round. I moved there in the summer of 2024 to take a night shift nursing position at the little clinic that serves the island and the surrounding county, because the pay differential for nights was significant, and because, at the time, I wanted to be somewhere quiet after a bad couple of years in Orlando. I rented a raised stilt house on a side street off 2nd Street, the kind built up on pilings because of the flooding, with a carport underneath and a set of wooden stairs leading up to the front door. My name's not important for this. I'll just tell it the way. I worked 11 at night to 7 in the morning, 3 nights a week, which meant my schedule was completely inverted from almost everyone else on the island. I slept during the day with blackout curtains, ran errands in the evening before my shift, and mostly saw the town at hours other people didn't. I got to know a few of the other night people. A bartender named Renata Cho, who worked at the one place on the island that stayed open past 10, and a guy named Tobias Lindqvist, who ran the overnight bait shop counter for fishermen heading out before dawn. We'd sometimes get coffee together around 5 a.m. at the one gas station that stayed open, comparing notes on how dead the island got that time of night, joking about it, the 3 of us, and whoever else happened to be. The first 6 months were fine, better than fine. I liked the job. I liked the quiet. I liked coming home at 7:15 in the morning to a town that was just starting to wake up while I was winding down. My next-door neighbor was a woman named Wanda Kessler, in her 60s, retired from teaching, who kept an eye on things the way older residents in small towns tend to do. She was the one who first mentioned Curtis to me, though not by that name. She just referred to him as that Halloran boy, and it took me a few months to understand what she meant by it. Cedar Key, like a lot of small towns, has its own version of a person everybody knows about and nobody quite talks about directly. I want to be honest that I didn't think much of this at the time. Every small town has a Curtis Halloran. I'd grown up in a town with one myself. I filed it away as background information, the kind of local color you pick up without really absorbing it. The thing that changed my relationship to that piece of information happened in January 2025, on a Wednesday night, driving to work. I left my house around 10:20 p.m. to make my 11 p.m. shift, and as I was pulling out of my carport, my headlights swept across the yard next door, Not Wanda's side, the other side, a smaller rental that had been empty for a while, and caught a man standing at the property line, close enough to my own fence that for a second I thought he was in my yard. He didn't move when the lights hit him. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching my car. I didn't get a good look at his face, but something about the stillness of it stuck with me the whole drive to the clinic, a low hum of unease I couldn't fully account for. I mentioned it to Renata over coffee that week, describing the guy, and she said, without much hesitation, "That's probably Curtis." She said it so casually that I let it go. This is the thing about small towns that I think outsiders don't always understand. There's a version of vigilance that gets worn down by familiarity, where everyone around you has decided a certain amount of strangeness is just texture, just part of the place, and you start to absorb that same calibration even when your own instincts are telling you something different. Over the following 3 more times, once walking along 2nd Street around midnight as I drove to work, not doing anything, just walking, and glancing at my car as it passed in a way that felt deliberate. Once standing at the base of my own carport stairs at close to 4 a.m., which I only know because my house has a motion light that caught him on its sensor and woke me. I was sleeping days by then, and the light flicking on outside my bedroom window at that hour pulled me straight up out of sleep, heart already going, and by the time I got to the window, there was nobody there, just the light slowly cycling back off. And once, the one that finally made me say something to someone official, sitting in a plastic chair on my own carport, underneath my house, at 2:40 in the morning, when I came home early from a shift because the clinic had lost power and sent the night staff home. I pulled in, saw a shape sitting in a chair that belonged to me, under my own house, and for a full 3 or 4 seconds my brain simply refused to process it as a person. Then he stood up, slowly, unbothered, the same unhurried quality I'd noticed as a theme through all of this. The sense that whoever these people were, in both these stories and the one before it, none of them ever seemed to feel any urgency about being seen, and walked past my car, close enough that I could smell cigarettes and something sweeter underneath it, maybe rum, and said, "Didn't expect you back so early," in a voice that was almost friendly, before continuing down the street on foot. I sat in my car in my own carport for probably 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line the next afternoon, and a deputy named Alan Voss came out to take a report. He knew exactly who I meant when I described Curtis, which told me something in itself. He said Curtis had a few priors. He wouldn't specify what for, but that trespassing was hard to make stick on an island where property lines were loosely respected by half the town, and where, as far as he knew, Curtis hadn't ever actually gone inside anyone's house or damaged anything. "He's a presence," is the phrase Deputy Voss used, and I remember thinking that was an almost clinical way to describe the feeling of finding a strange man sitting in your own chair at 3 in the morning. I started locking the carport gate after that, a flimsy thing that had come with the house and that I'd never bothered with before. The night everything came to a head was in April, a Thursday. I remember the date because it was the night before Good Friday, and the clinic had been unusually busy for a Thursday, someone's fishing accident that had come in around 1 a.m. needing stitches, so I got home later than usual, around 7:40 in the morning instead of 7:15, already exhausted in that specific way night shift exhausts you, where daylight starts to feel hostile. I noticed the carport gate was open before I even parked. I'd locked it myself the night before. I was certain of that. It was the kind of small ritual I'd built into my routine, specifically because of everything that had happened over the previous few months. I sat in my car off, just looking at it, and then I did something I probably shouldn't have, which is that I got out and went to check it myself instead of calling anyone first. The lock hadn't been broken. It had been picked, or at least it wasn't forced. There was no damage to the hasp, nothing bent. Whoever had gotten in cleanly. My stairs were undisturbed as far as I could tell, and my front door was still locked when I checked it. But there, on the second step from the bottom, was a single cigarette, unsmoked, stood upright, balanced carefully on its filter end, like someone had placed it there deliberately rather than dropped it. I didn't touch it. I called Deputy Voss directly this time, since I had his card, and he came out and photographed it and told me honestly that there wasn't much to be done with a single unlit cigarette on a step, that it wasn't evidence of a crime in any way he could act on, but that he'd go have a conversation with Curtis anyway, informally, just to make clear people had noticed. I don't know what that conversation looked like, or if it happened at all. What I do know is that for the following 3 weeks, I didn't see him once. Not walking the street, not at the property line, nothing. And I let myself believe, again, the way I had in the earlier lull, that it was over. Then, in May, I came home from a shift around 7:20 a.m. to find my carport gate locked, exactly the way I'd left it. Nothing disturbed, nothing to report to anyone, except sitting on the same second step, upright, balanced on its filter end, was another cigarette. The gate had not been opened. I checked the lock myself, twice, and it was intact, exactly as I'd left it. I never figured out how it got there. I never saw him near my house again after that, not once, in the 4 remaining months I lived on the island. And I moved to Gainesville that September, closer to a hospital with day shift openings, in part for the commute, and in part because I no longer particularly wanted to be alone in a house at night, no matter how quiet the island was. I think about Deputy Voss's phrase sometimes. He's a presence, because it stayed with me as the truest and least satisfying way anyone ever described what those months were like. Nothing was ever taken from me. My door was never actually opened, as far as I know. Nobody could point to a single moment and call it a crime. And yet I spent the better part of a year working a job I loved, in a town I'd chosen specifically for its quiet, learning to move through my own life around the edges of somebody else's unhurried, patient attention, and never once getting an answer for why, or what it meant, or whether that second cigarette was a coincidence, a message, or something in between that I still don't have a... That's all 3 stories for tonight. If you've lived somewhere like this, a small town, a place where everyone supposedly knows everyone, where you tell yourself nothing bad really happens there, you know that feeling of safety is thinner than people admit. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't the monster in the dark. It's the neighbor who's always a little too aware of your schedule. The stranger everyone's decided is harmless. The thing you talk yourself out of reporting because on its own, it doesn't sound like enough. If any of these stories hit close to home, or if you've got your own experience like this, drop it in the comments. I read everyone, and some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment on a video just like this one. If you want more true small town horror, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because there's more of these coming. Stay safe out there, and maybe check your porch light before you go to bed.